The World Health Organization is expected to reclassify the artificial sweetener aspartame as a possible carcinogen. So, in this week's episode, we cover what does this mean? What is the research over the years that has gotten us to this point? What does this mean for us? And what are steps that we can take?
Yay Networks.
A quick note before we dive into today's podcast. If you like what you hear, I would love for you to subscribe to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, wherever you download your podcast. It would also be incredible if you take a minute to rate and review this podcast. Those things do matter and they really help us. I'm Molly Kimball. Welcome to Fueled, a wellness and nutrition podcast. I'm a registered dietitian and nutrition journalist with a passion to help people live their strongest, healthiest life possible. In my weekly TV segments and columns, there's a limited amount of time and space to cover everything, but there's so much more to share. This podcast is my opportunity to dive deeper into the topics you want to know about. I wanted to share with y'all some of the science behind the headlines that y'all might be seeing. So the World Health Organization is anticipated to update its essentially opinion or how it classifies aspartame. Aspartame is the artificial sweetener found in products like Equal or Diet Coke to be a possible carcinogen, meaning that it possibly causes cancer. And we're going to go deep into this, what the headlines are saying, how we got here, what the research is behind this, what the research has been over the past, 40 years or so that aspartame has been in our food supply on the market. And then what does this mean for us? What things do we need to learn from it? What things do we need to change, consider changing? And I actually first saw this headline. A client sent me the link whenever it was first announced. So I didn't even see it in like the news briefs that I get. He sent it to me before I even saw it that way. And it was actually a pretty rewarding email. It was a client I had met with like over a decade ago. And he had come to me, he had been diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And he had come to me to essentially say, what can I do to maximize all aspects of my health, of my nutrition? What can I do to be as proactive and preventative as possible? And one of the things, and I remember him, and I remember this part of the conversations that we had. And one of the things that we changed, or that I had suggested to him, he was a really big Diet Coke drinker and had a lot of sources of aspartame in a lot of areas of his diet, from Diet Cokes to flavored yogurts and sugar-free mints and stuff like that. So the email that I got from him said, Molly, and he kind of reintroduced himself. And he said, more than a decade ago, you encouraged me to stop drinking Diet Coke. Your father had lymphoma like me, which my dad did. My dad had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma also when I was in my 20s. He was like, and you pointed to some research that said that aspartame may have been a contributing factor, which I'll share more about that with y'all in a minute. And he said, I gave it up after our visit and I haven't had a single one since. And he said, finally, the FDA appears to agree with you, and then linked to the headline that said that the World Health Organization and some of the other committees that we'll talk about are taking a closer look and looking at newer research, looking at current research to basically reassess the position on aspartame. And it's suspected, so this podcast is dropping on a Thursday, the 13th. It's suspected that they're going to release the update of this, which will be tomorrow. I'm recording this a few days in advance, but on Friday the 14th. So I'll put any links to updated announcements and things like that. I'll put the links to that in the show notes, and we'll update that on Friday when those come out, if that's as expected. But what is anticipated from those who are kind of inside these conversations and inside these decisions is that the World Health Organization is going to be reclassifying, they're updating its risk assessment, looking at what it considers to be like acceptable daily intake, and reclassifying aspartame as a class 2 carcinogen, meaning that it has a possible link to cancer. And so that client who sent that was one of many people that over the years, and it's myself included, when we look at what does the research say and what's the research shown us over the, since the late 70s into the 80s when aspartame was approved for use, And now that we have so many other options of sweeteners that are natural, they're plant based, they are not chemically created, they're not synthetically derived like aspartame, let's explore those other options. So years ago, there really wasn't many other options. You had either the sugar sweetened version or you had the aspartame sweetened version. And then, or the saccharin sweetened version. So you either had equal or sweet and low or sugar. And then there came Splenda, which is also still kind of a synthetic, chemically created sweetener. And then there's other plant based sweeteners now, things like stevia or monk fruit or these others. And there's so many other options now. So I guess let's start with a little bit of a look at the headlines and then some of the research of why these organizations and these health organizations are taking a closer look. Aspartame is the name that we see it whenever it's an ingredient in something like a Diet Coke or a yogurt or something like that. But it's also sold under the brand Equal, which of course, everyone's familiar with that. There's others like amino sweet, but aspartame, it's a chemical combination of two types of amino acids. And for years, since the 80s essentially, there have been questions of cancer or neurological problems connected to intake of aspartame, and there's been a lot of mixed studies and mixed reviews. And so there was a study back in the 70s. Now, the FDA approved aspartame for use as a tabletop sweetener, so a little packaged sweetener like the blue packets. Those were approved for use in 1981, which is crazy. Like it's over 40 years. And I don't know that I remember when it came out, but I remember the idea that it was new. I remember as like a really little kid, saccharin or sweet and low was what, had been used if someone didn't want sugar. And I remember the idea that equal was like a new option for people. So it's crazy to me that that's been like 40 years ago. So in 1981, it was approved for use by the FDA as a tabletop sweetener, as a packaged sweetener. And then also in things like breakfast cereals or powdered drink mixes, think things like Crystal Light. And then 2 years later, it was approved for use in soft drinks, which is, of course, like the biggest reach as far as where we're going to have that consumption of it. It's one of the largest sweeteners, artificial sweeteners used in like the diet soft drink market. So that's sort of the timeline of when it came into our food supply. There was a study done in the 70s. It was an industry sponsored study that initially had raised some concern that aspartame was linked to brain tumors in studies in rats. But the FDA and an independent review panel looked at this, assessed it, and said, no, we're going to decide that it's safe and we'll approve for it to be used in our food supply. And there's something that's looked at, basically, it's referred to as an acceptable daily intake. And the acceptable daily intake of aspartame is established at about 50 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So if you look at someone who's 150 pounds and you do the math and you figure out kilograms, that's more than 3,000 milligrams of aspartame that would be before these new standards are released tomorrow. That's what's been established as the acceptable daily intake, over 3,000 milligrams for someone who's 150-pound person. To put that into a little bit of a perspective, a packet of Equal has about 37 milligrams of aspartame. So the idea was you'd have to have a lot of this in order to reach these toxic levels. And so over the years, it has been considered basically generally recognized as safe, and that someone would have to consume just an inordinate amount of aspartame to reach those toxic levels. The amount of aspartame for basically a typical 12-ounce can of Diet Coke or we'll say diet soft drink, we'll keep it generic on that. Diet soft drink is about 192 milligrams. So a packet of Equal, about 37 milligrams. A diet soft drink, a 12-ounce can of diet soft drink, just under 200 milligrams. So when we look at, the current for years and decades, what that acceptable daily intake has been, what's in our food supply seems to be far less. So separately, kind of over the years, there's been more and more studies that have come up and and just raised some questions. So there was an Italian study, it was an animal study that looked at animals that were exposed to aspartame starting at 8 weeks of age. And then through their lives, looking at the likelihood of them to develop things like lymphomas, leukemias, other tumors. And they saw that the exposure to aspartame increased the likelihood that they did have these things, the lymphomas, leukemias, tumors, including kidney tumors, which were rare in the type of rat used in those studies. So there was starting to be a little bit of a question in the early 2000s about it. More follow-up studies looking at this that expose rats not only to aspartame starting at a very young age, but also starting in the womb. So almost mimicking if a mother was consuming aspartame, saying during pregnancy. And so that also found that aspartame raised the incidence, increased the incidence of lymphomas, leukemias, also breast cancer. But on the flip side, there have also been studies, animal studies and human studies, that have shown that, again, kind of the typical intake of aspartame in our diets is fine. It is not increasing risk of certain of cancers or other types of chronic diseases. So the research has been very divided. It has been, you can find research pointing to, yes, there's an issue with it. We should be concerned about our intake of aspartame. There's also research that points to, that aspartame intake is fine. There's a lot of flaws in a lot of the research. Much of it, looking at the human studies, is looking at self-reported data, looking at what people are saying was their typical consumption of aspartame. And, not that anybody would specifically intentionally not give that accurate report, but when we self-report, there's inevitably going to be error there. If you're looking at a study that is, maybe an animal study or very well controlled, that there's no question about what dose was given to these. But in humans, it's all over the place. When we're self-reporting, that can be very, very unreliable in terms of the data. So going back to that conversation I had with that client over a decade ago, the question that there could be potential for aspartame to increase risk of things like leukemias and lymphomas, the way that I have looked at it, since learning that or since seeing that research was, well, if there's potential and we have other options and this isn't something that we must consume, well, then let's go with these other options. If someone we'll just use Diet Coke, and we're sort of picking on Diet Coke because there's a lot of other products that have aspartame in it. But if someone's a big Diet Coke drinker, let's try to find something else that can help to, give them or satisfy that craving, or find something else that they can kind of gradually train their taste buds to enjoy as much. So where the research is divided, and when we look at independent studies and we look at, that some show cancer causing effect, others show none at all. To me, if there's a question and we've got other options, then let's explore those. Let's take a minute to share about Caraway Home, our partner for this week's episode. Caraway Home's non-toxic kitchenware collections make cooking and baking a piece of cake. We love our Caraway cookware. It's our go-to for everything from seared salmon to creamy spinach to our Eat Fit candied cashews. Their pans heat up so quickly, they cook evenly, they are incredibly easy to clean. And with our exclusive discount, you can now save on the full suite of Caraway products, including their internet famous non-toxic cookware set, also Caraway's food storage, tea kettle, and mini cookware. Visit carawayhome.com/fueled to take advantage of this limited time offer for 10% off your next purchase. This deal is exclusive for our listeners, so visit carawayhome.com/fueled or use promo code FUELED at checkout. Caraway, non-toxic cookware made modern. So where we are now, a couple of weeks ago, the World Health Organization's Cancer Research Agency, you may hear both mentioned. There's the World Health Organization, and the specific cancer research agency inside of that is called the International Agency for Research on Cancer. You may see it as IARC. I've seen just that acronym and haven't been clear on what it was, or it's not always clear on what that is. But that's basically the cancer research agency within that World Health Organization. It was, the news was shared a couple of weeks ago that they plan, likely tomorrow on the 14th, to reclassify the artificial sweetener aspartame as a possible carcinogen. The way that works, when you look at what is listed as a carcinogen. There's different classifications or different categories for classifying the cancer risk of certain foods or certain chemicals. And it's 4 categories, but it's basically 1 through 3. So something that's a class 1 carcinogen means that that item can cause cancer. So things that are class 1 carcinogen, tobacco is a class 1 carcinogen. Cured meats, processed meats, class 1 carcinogen. Class 2 has two categories. So class 2A means that it's probably does. Class 2B means it possibly does. So it gets confusing. And then class 3 means there's no cancer risk. So class 1, yes, it's believed that it can cause cancer. 2A means it probably does. 2B means it possibly does. And so the agency has reportedly said that they're going to declare aspartame a class 2B carcinogen, meaning that it possibly causes cancer. So when we look at, other class 1 carcinogens, like we said, tobacco, et cetera, it's a lower risk than that. But again, going back to that conversation of, well, we don't need to consume aspartame. There's a lot of other natural plant-based sweeteners. There's also the idea of limiting our intake of such sweet sweeteners anyway, and really training our taste buds to be comfortable and satisfied and happy with foods that maybe taste more like that real food versus having just such that sweet effect to it. The reason I'm talking about this is, one, I want to talk about what are some of the things that it's in and what are some alternatives, and just kind of get you thinking about it, and also just covering, what the deal is with this as we're hearing the news about it. But also, one of the things that I'm really excited about of the possibility of this is that when there is large conversation around things like this, like the World Health Organization is, acknowledging that there is possible cancer risk for a sweetener like aspartame when there's so many other alternatives out there now, what that means or can mean is big change in the food industry. So when things like the USDA changes the dietary guidelines and they really tighten up on things like trans fats, and the recommendation from the USDA and the dietary guidelines, years ago, really emphasized decreasing our intake of trans fats, which are, they can have a negative effect on cholesterol, kind of lowering your good and raising your bad, to just really oversimplify it. But when the recommendation was made, food makers were using a ton of trans fats because it really helped food stay shelf stable. It helped the texture. It helped them bakery items. It made them have a wonderful texture and last longer. And they were used in a huge amount of our food supply. As soon as the USDA came out with a recommendation to keep our intake as close to zero as possible, food makers had to find other options. They had to do better. Same with sodium, as the dietary guidelines have really tightened up on our recommendations for sodium intake. Food makers, some have been doing it not so quietly. They've been very vocal that they're reducing and improving the sodium intake or sodium content of their foods. Other food makers have been doing it really subtly. They have been dropping, by 5% or 10% at a time, the sodium in those, especially packaged foods and processed foods. And so if you look at things like frozen dinners, especially the brands of like healthier frozen dinners and things kind of in your freezer section, if you looked at what the sodium was in those, let's say a decade ago, compared to what they are now, it's, and many times 25, 35% less, if not more, because they've been gradually doing it over time. And so the regular purchasers of those foods weren't even noticing it because it was such subtle change over time. So some food makers, again, shouting it from the rooftops that they were making these changes, dropping the sodium in their foods. Others did it without saying anything and doing it really subtly and very slowly. But point being, when there is a major position shift in the scientific or health recommendations, the public health recommendations, not only does that help to educate us as consumers, but it can have massive implications for the food industry and what they're creating, what they're making, what they're providing on the shelves for us. So now we get to the part of, what does this mean for me? So if you have been either a big consumer across the board of, foods, drinks that are high in aspartame, then I would just take a look at what you are reaching for that is a no sugar option. It could be your soft drink, it could be an ice cream, it could be a yogurt, things like common things are going to be diet soft drinks. Things like Crystal Light are a really big source, common source of artificial sweeteners like aspartame. Um, Things like sugar-free Jello, sugar-free puddings, those types of things can have aspartame or typically have aspartame in them. A lot of sugar-free jams or fruit spreads, like no sugar added yogurts, cereals. Chewing gum is another really big one. So I love like extra polar ice. I love it. And my husband has pointed out, Molly, that's got aspartame in it. So while I have carefully evaluated everything and found alternatives, that's one that I've personally really struggled with. So I'll share with y'all some of the changes that I'm making, and then I'll kind of share with y'all also some of the other options that are out there to just keep your eye out for. When we talk about where to find these options that I'll be talking about, you can every product of course has a store finder locator practically these days. You can go to a store like Whole Foods and you're going to find a plethora of options. You can go to your, natural local health food store, you'll find a bunch of options. And then a lot of our local grocery stores and supermarkets, it may not be, sometimes these are going to be on their aisles next to the similar products, but sometimes they're going to be on their special kind of like healthy section of those stores. And then I'll also say stores like Walmart have a really stunningly good selection of a lot of these types of products too. So, Super Target or Target or places like that. So, hear these products, hear these ideas, start to keep an eye out for them, different places you grocery shop. Of course, online is always going to be an option too, but if you can find these at your stores, if you can't and you shop at the same local store, ask your store manager to carry them. And then buy them from them instead of ordering online because it's easier. Support the local stores, asking them to carry it. A lot of times our local grocery stores and supermarkets are happy to bring in products, for the regular customers, who are asking for these things. So probably I would say one of the more common, probably the two most common things that I see people consuming aspartame. One is the equal packets, kind of like the sugar packets, but just the equal packets that people are adding to coffee or tea or oatmeal or whatever it is. And so what do you use instead of equal? The thing about equal or, aspartame, but we'll just call it equal right now in terms of the sugar packets, it's really hundreds and hundreds of times sweeter than regular sugar. And so if you're going to use another type of a sweetener like Swerve or Truvia, those are much more like a one-to-one sweetness compared to sugar. So if you've been used to that really intense sweetener that equal gives us, then you're probably not going to be happy going to just a packet of something like a Swerve or a Truvia. The sweeteners, the plant-based sweeteners that are so intensely sweet like that, though, are stevia and monk fruit. So much so that if you use them in a large amount, it's going to be bitter. You can easily not like it. You could easily think that it's bitter. And so stevia or monk fruit, I find, are typically, I don't want to say like palatable because it's more than palatable. Surprisingly pleasing replacements for aspartame for people. So if you've been doing equal, if you've been doing aspartame, try stevia, try monk fruit instead of your equal packets. And it's one of those things, it's going to be different, but give it a couple of weeks, give it a couple of, give it a fair shake and then see how does it turn out. And so for packets, you can buy, there is little stevia packets that you can buy, powdered stevia packets, and you can have it, keep it on you, keep it in your purse, keep it at your kitchen, wherever you're typically using it. And it's powdered packets. There's also drops that people can use of stevia. You can do the same thing with monk fruit. You can buy monk fruit in the packets of sweeteners, like you would, again, an equal packet. And there's also little monk fruit drops. So one brand that I really like, they have stevia and they have monk fruit, is a brand called Wholesome. And it is simply just called Wholesome. And you can find basically the stevia packets, or you can also buy monk fruit from them. And then there's a brand, Lakanto, Lakanto, and they have monk fruit drops. And so that's something that can go really well into a coffee or a tea because there's not an issue with it dissolving or anything like that. So those are an easy swap out. They're there, they're available, they're on shelves. You can find them at a variety of the stores like we talked about, or find them online. But stevia or monk fruit packets or drops can be a really easy just stand in, almost same amount of packet for same amount of packet or drops as you're using with the equal. I would say the hardest one that I'm going to, well, for me, the hardest one is the sugar-free gum, which we'll come to. But another really hard one is the diet soft drink. So if someone's a Diet Coke drinker, you've got aspartame and or whatever your favorite diet soft drink is, it's got aspartame in it. It's really hard to find one that is a pleasing replacer for you. But try Zevia. It's spelled Zevia. So this is a stevia sweetened soft drink. They do have a cola type soft drink, and it's zero sugar. It's no artificial colors, no artificial flavors or anything like that. The caffeine in it is about 45 milligrams per 12-ounce can. So you've still got your little dose of caffeine. No, it's not going to taste the same, as your Diet Coke or Diet Dr. Pepper or whatever it is that you're reaching for now. But try it, see if, buy yourself, a couple of 6-packs, try over time and see. And again, just like if you're switching from equal packets to stevia packets or monk fruit packets, you got to give it time, give it a fair shake. I would say the same thing with something like these Zevia cans. Also, or if you're one that you're doing, 3, 4, 5 or more Diet Cokes in a day, we'll dial it back to one. And if that one Diet Coke is enough to kind of satisfy it and you were doing 3, 4 more or whatever, it's still a success and it's still a heck of a lot better to dial it back to one. And so if you are one that you can go that moderate route and one doesn't creep back to 3, 4, 5, 6, and you can keep it just at one a day, there's a lot worse that we could be doing. So it also, I think, is important to know that with this recommendation and with the anticipated change and the classification of this, it doesn't mean that we have to banish every single thing from our diets. If we can remove it, change it, find better alternatives that we're happy with, that's amazing. But if we currently have a pretty heavy intake and we're able to dial it back to something that's just a lot lower and a lot more moderate, that's a success as well. So I think it's important to simply be aware that there's a question over this and we have other options. And so in the situations when we can reach for those other options, let's try to just educate ourselves and surround ourselves with those options when that's possible. So Diet Coke or diet soft drinks, I find, is probably one of the hardest ones. Zevia is the closest I've seen to something like that. But otherwise, I don't have one that I've found is just a crowd pleaser. And I would say if you can whittle down the number of diet soft drinks you're having a day and or find an alternative that's a natural one like that, I would consider that a success. If you can get, to things like, considering something like a sparkling water, but I know it's not the same. And a lot of times you're looking for the flavor. You might be looking for the caffeine boost. It's all of it. So something like a sparkling water or a flavored sparkling water, I know it's not the same. The other one that I mentioned that I think is just one of the hardest is sugar-free chewing gum. And so I like the extra. It has a lot of flavor. It lasts really long. It stays really soft. It doesn't become this like hard chewing gum very quickly. I have not yet found something that I have found is what I think is a really great alternative for it. There are several that I'm going to share with y'all. There's one called Simply. The brand is called Simply Gum. The sugar-free version they have in it is sweetened with xylitol. So it's important to know that can upset some people's stomachs. It can also be toxic to animals. So you want to be mindful of that and watch out for that. There's another chewing gum called Pure, Pur is what that one is called. And those are two of the ones that I've seen that have been kind of the most common in natural food stores and online. There's a lot of others. There's one called Spree. There's a lot of others that are, they're good and they are natural plant-based sweeteners and they're zero sugar. To me, the reason I haven't loved them is the texture. Like the flavor tends to go a little bit faster. The texture, it tends to get harder quicker. So for me, probably what that's going to end up meaning is sort of like I was just talking about the Diet Coke. It may mean that I'm chewing less of the chewing gum because it's not something that I find like as good. So I'll dial back and then maybe switch to these other alternatives. But I have a feeling with these other alternatives, I simply wouldn't be having as much. The others that I see often is something like Crystal Light. That is one that is a really common, and I'll use the term Crystal Light kind of generically. There are a lot of other brands besides Crystal Light that are similar, but y'all get the idea. It's that same type of a product. Um, there are some that are called like basically it's just like I can't remember if it's called Simply or Truly, but I see them at Walmart. They have lime, they have lemon, they have like a black cherry version, and it is basically just like the dried fruit essences in a little packet that you would add into your water, just like you would with the Crystal Light. But there's nothing in there. There's no artificial anything in these. So that's one option, and they're basically just like truly pure like lime or lemon or black cherry. They're little packets. And again, you add it to your water bottle just like you would something like a Crystal Light to to either a single serving or you can make it larger. At places like Whole Foods, I see a product called Stir. It's STUR. And this is one that is sweetened with stevia and it's little drops. So sort of like those Mio drops. The Mio drops are also artificially sweetened, but this is like that. They're called Stir, STUR. They have all different flavors. They're stevia sweetened and they're no calorie. And you can add something like that to your water bottle. Again, I know a lot of people listening would be like, well, just drink the water plain. And I get it. And, I personally, I don't use a lot of, or I don't put things in the water like that, like Crystal Light or anything like that to flavor it. I do have just the plain, plain sparkling water or plain water. But I do understand, like, if you're used to having that flavor in your water, then we want to find something that's going to help you continue to drink enough water. And a lot of people tend to drink more when it's flavored. So another thing that you can do is you can take herbal tea. And there's so many varieties, so many flavors. There's cinnamon, there's peppermint, there's peach, there's like literally any kind of flavor. The bags of tea in any grocery store, those aisles and those selections tend to be just ever expanding. And so if there's a flavor of that tea that you like and you have, let's say, a 16 or 20 ounce bottle that you can fill with water, you can just put that bag in there and let it kind of sit and it's naturally going to add that flavor. You can, of course, do the same thing and steep it and have a pitcher of that in your fridge. But even if you haven't thought ahead of time to do that, you can take those bags of tea, flavored tea, put it into your water bottle, just let it sit there, infuse for just a little bit, and you'll get the flavor of that. So even stuffing the little herbal tea bag into your water bottle is fine. Or again, brewing it, thinking ahead, making a picture of that, keeping it in your fridge. And then the other one that I wanted to share with y'all, there's a product called Ultima. It's ULTIMA. And it is little sticks that are it's probably the closest that you'll see to something like a Crystal Light lemonade. And so they have like a pink lemonade flavor and stuff like that. And it's little drink stick mixes. And they're electrolyte mixes, but they're really low sodium. So a lot of electrolyte mixes are higher sodium because they're trying to replenish that for people who are losing a lot of sweat. But in this case, it's pretty low, 55. And this is something that can give you, and it's 0 calories, and it is sweetened with stevia. The colors in there are things like vegetable juices and stuff like that for colors. But the flavor in this, the whole experience of this is probably the closest I've seen to something like a Crystal Light. The Ultima is the name of it, ULTIMA. Something like the pink lemonade, I think, would be a good option for someone who's been used to something like a Crystal Light lemonade. Keeping these packets, adding it to your water bottle, I think would feel like a very similar experience. I've found these at places like Whole Foods and then also local health food or kind of athletic stores, or again, you can look for them online. So those are some of the solutions for the packets for Diet Coke or diet soft drinks, I should say, for chewing gum, for things like a Crystal Light. And then on the Jell-O section, I don't know how many of you are Jell-O eaters, but there is a brand. It's been around for years, and they've updated their packaging, and I think it looks really it's appealing looking. The brand is called Simply Delish, Delish, and they have flavors like strawberry, raspberry, and it's basically like what we would think of as just Jell-O, but they're sweetened with natural plant-based sweeteners, including stevia. So it's still basically a sugar-free Jell-O that is natural plant-based sweeteners, not artificially sweetened. So there are lots of options out there. We just have to keep our eyes open for them. So again, this conversation or this reclassification of aspartame, the expected reclassification as that class 2B carcinogen, it doesn't mean that we can't ever have it. It does just mean that we want to be aware that there is a question about this when we're looking at the safety of aspartame, and that there's objective data that is pointing to this question. And so instead of just kind of turning an eye and ignoring it, we do have other options. We have other sweetener options. There's other product options. Some of them are going to be easier than others. Some of them are going to require maybe a little bit more of a conscious behavior change or habit change. But it's just like anything, looking at our nutrition, our intake across the board. Is there, there may be aspects that you do really infrequently, and it really is probably not a significant contributor to an intake of something like aspartame. And then others, if you're doing it on the daily, then, it can be worth exploring. It can be a reasonable thing to say, hey, let me find other ways that I can limit my intake of this. I'll include links with more information in the show notes of this episode. We'll also be updating it as more comes out with the official announcement from the World Health Organization. And let me know what you think about it. If you've already started to make some of these changes, and over the years you've transitioned away from the artificial sweeteners, and there's certain things that have really worked well for you, I always want to hear about it. We always learn from you guys. If there's certain things that you're struggling with, or if you just have questions about how important is this really? All of this, reach out. We always want to know. I am registered dietitian Molly Kimball, and you've been listening to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, the podcast. If you'd like more Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, please head over to mollykimball.com. You can follow me, Molly Kimball RD, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you haven't yet, please go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Join us next week for another dose of Fueled Wellness and Nutrition. Thanks for listening, and stay focused on living your strongest, healthiest life.